Every disaster ends with a story that tries to make everyone feel resolved. For the stationary low-power reactor number 1, this story was simple. A man made a mistake, or worse, a man made a choice. A control rod was pulled too far, and the reactor responded exactly as physics demands. 3 men died, case closed. It is a clean explanation, reassuring that the failure has a name, a face, and a single moment where everything went wrong. Remove the human error, and the system works just fine. That version of events spread quickly. It appeared in early summaries, later documentaries, and eventually hardened into something close to fact. The implication was clear. This wasn't a dangerous machine. It was a tragic lapse. And if that were true, SL-1 would be easy to understand. But the story only works if you don't look too closely, because once you do, the numbers stop lining up, and the certainty of that 20 inches starts to feel less like a measurement and more like a conclusion looking for someone to land on.
Analyzing the data, that an average man could withdraw the blade fast enough and far enough to reach the observed 20-inch final position before steam generation terminated the power excursion.
Safe lies don't just explain disasters. They protect the systems that cause them. The claim is that the central control rod was lifted roughly 50 centimeters, far past its safe range, instantly driving the reactor prompt critical. On paper, that sounds decisive, a reckless behavior by the operator. But at SL-1, the difference between safe and fatal wasn't a dramatic pull. It was a narrow, uncertain band of reactivity where a few extra centimeters mattered more than force or speed. The system didn't require violence, just proximity to the wrong condition. And that is where the story starts to fray. SL-1 was a small experimental boiling water reactor built to supply power and heat to remote military installations. Its design philosophy favored compactness and simplicity over redundancy. Fewer systems, fewer components, less margin. The reactor itself was relatively small, about 4.5 centimeters tall and just over 1.2 meters in diameter, housed inside a specially built cavity roughly 5.8 meters deep. Beneath the vessel sat a dry shield mixture near ground level, while the surrounding cavity was filled with gravel for additional shielding. Inside the vessel, the active core was compact, about 67 centimeters high, positioned roughly 80 centimeters above the base. The reactor was filled with water to a height of approximately 2.1 meters, serving as both coolant and neutral moderator. The core was divided into 16 segments, each holding 4 fuel elements, except for corner positions near the vessel walls. Each fuel element contained uranium-235 at roughly 91% enrichment. Between the fuel elements ran narrow guide channels that allowed the control rods to move vertically through the core. The control rods themselves were cross-shaped, measuring roughly 36 centimeters across at its widest, with a length of about 1.3 meters and 75 centimeter length at their thinnest sections. A 2.1 meter steel bar connected the rod with the drive mechanism located at floor level. Because the fissile portion of the fuel extended only about 64 centimeters, the control rods had more than enough absorber length, 81 centimeters, to fully cover the active fuel region when properly positioned. At its core, the reactor worked like this. Fuel rods produced heat through nuclear fission. Water flowed through the core, acting as both coolant and neutral moderator. As water absorbed heat, it boiled, producing steam that could be used for power generation. Reactivity, or the rate of fission, was controlled by control rods inserted into the core, which absorbed neutrons. Push them in, the reaction slowed. Pull them out, it accelerated. So far, everything is standard. What made SL-1 different was how much control was concentrated. The central control rod carried a disproportionately large share of the reactor's reactivity authority. Withdraw it far enough, and the reactor could transition from delayed, controllable fission into prompt criticality, where the reaction accelerates faster than human or mechanical systems can respond. During normal operation, this was managed by procedures and discipline, but during maintenance, it became dangerous. To reconnect the control rods after shutdown, operators had to manually lift each rod about 10 centimeters to reattach it to its drive mechanism. This required opening the reactor vessel head and physically handling the rod from above. There were no physical stops limiting upward motion, no interlocks preventing excessive withdrawal, no automatic shutdown systems active during this step. The reactor was considered safe, so as long as the rod was only lifted a few centimeters. From understanding this design, one thing becomes quite evident. The reactor was planned for this. Perhaps a military self-destruct requirement to hide its technology if things went south during the Cold War, or they wanted a nuclear reactor so simple that safety barriers were just completely ignored. They got both. The worst part is that a human could initiate the process physically or mechanically with moderate effort. Either way, this only answers the question of why it was allowed to be operated in such manner. The problem now is, how far would you have to pull the rod for the system to go prompt critical? The report concluded that the only way would be if the central rod was lifted about 50 centimeters. That number was inferred from the criticality chart of the reactor. Conveniently, the rod was also found stuck at that position. Once written down, the number did what numbers always do. It solidified. It implied a distance that had to be traveled deliberately. By attaching the incident to a number, it cleverly reframed the accident of a system that tolerated razor-thin margins into a story about someone going far past them. The rod was lifted for sure, but how or why it was lifted remains a mystery. Or does it? During the investigation, one recurring problem was quickly dismissed: friction and binding of the control rods. During maintenance, the rods were handled manually, guided through tight channels only 5 millimeters wide, where even minor misalignment could create resistance or momentary binding. The rod itself was 1.3 meters long and traveled fully inside the channel. Operators and engineers had long treated uneven rod motion as a mechanical inconvenience. Familiar, manageable, not a safety concern. Because, at the end of the day, the rods usually behaved well enough, so friction was never elevated past the casual factor. The assumption remained that trained operators could compensate for mechanical imprecision, and conveniently, the investigation found no proof that friction alone caused the accident, and moved on. What was dismissed was not the possibility of binding itself, but its importance. And that distinction matters because taking binding seriously changes the entire tone of the event, something that the report, being long and detailed, hides reactor-level problems in plain sight by just acknowledging them instead of addressing how they interacted. For instance, the central control rod alone had a reactivity worth of 17%. Think of it like a volume dial that goes from 0 to 17. Disaster begins at just 0.6. The concentrated power on the central control rod is roughly 20 times more than what is needed to trigger an uncontrollable power spike. And that's not all. By the time of the accident, the reactor had already been burned through 40% of its lifetime. As fuel burns, the core becomes weaker and uneven. The lower portions of the fuel stack, where power is highest early in life, degrade first. To compensate, the control rods must be positioned higher in the core just to maintain operation. Over time, this increases the power imbalance between lower burn fuel and fresher fuel above it. In that state, less rod movement at a single point is required to produce a rapid power surge, because the rod is already sitting in the most reactive region. Finally, the reactor had been shut down for 11 days. During the reconnection process, the central rod had to be moved manually. It is plausible that the rod encountered resistance enough to require extra force. The assembly weighed roughly 38 kilograms, traveled through tight guide channels, and displaced water as it moved. This was not a component that could be accelerated smoothly or casually. These three pieces of information are scattered around the first pages of the report. On their own, they seem like technical detail, but together they are conclusive. Only a narrow set of possibilities can explain the accident, all of them consistent with small unintended motion having large consequences. First, the operator attempted to free a stuck rod, applied additional force, and the rod unexpectedly traveled the full distance required for prompt criticality. But naturally, to loosen a stuck rod, the most likely way operators would grab the handle would be with both arms pointing downwards. This configuration makes unlikely for the rod to travel 50 centimeters, though possible. Hands pointing up makes that likely, but an experienced operator would consider the danger of handling a stuck rod in such manner. Second, the rod was sufficiently stuck that a second operator assisted, briefly doubling the applied force. In that case, a sudden release could plausibly produce a larger than intended motion, which would also explain the outcome of the second operator. Both scenarios suggest operator's fault. However, as we've seen here, the machine was extremely overpowered and difficult to work with. Considering this, it leads us to a third, speculative but more troubling scenario. In this case, the rod is really stuck after 11 days without moving. The operator pulls the rod. It moves, but it gets stuck again, just a few centimeters above the threshold to initiate minor fission. Because the lower portions of the fuel have already been burned through, the operator thinks it's not a big deal to force it further. Heat is generated, just enough for water to flash into vapor around the fuel and guide structures. That vapor reduces resistance inside the channel at the worst possible moment. The operator, thinking that the rod is still stuck, compensates just enough to overcome friction, but the rod is already loose. Human force plus emerging vapor pressure carry the rod past the threshold before anyone has time to register what changed. The reactor goes prompt critical and bursts into oblivion. This possibility was quickly discarded for a simple reason. If true, it would mean the system was unstable and that normal manual handling could lead directly to runaway physics. It was known that the program for small military reactors depended entirely on the accomplishment of SL-1, and that conclusion was unacceptable. Once the physics had been reconstructed and the rod position settled, the investigation faced an uncomfortable question. Why would a trained operator, during a routine maintenance procedure, lift the central control rod far enough to destroy the reactor? This is uncomfortable for mainly two reasons. Training to handle the reactor took over 9 months to accomplish, where multiple tests were taken, along with various board evaluations. If the operator that supposedly pulled the rod was a good employee with no previous emotional problems or anything that would lead to this action, then their explanation has a major, unfillable gap, leading back to machine design problems. Second, if the operator had emotional issues or other complications, it meant that all 9 months of preparation, tests, and board assessments failed. They allowed an unstable individual to work with an incredibly dangerous machine. Regardless of individual motive, the program would never survive. But curiosity as to why an operator would pull the rod would, and they knew they could use that. An affair gossip, where the operator who lifted the rod had an intimate relationship with his co-worker's wife, emerged years later to justify murder-suicide. William McCown, in his book Idaho Falls: The Untold Story of America's First Nuclear Accident, investigated the love triangle rumors. There was indeed a problem with Barnes being threatened with divorce by his wife, and also that he was hot-tempered. However, this information was disclosed in an attempt to negate the stuck rod theory. After all, the conflict of interest was extreme. At the time, the Atomic Energy Commission was responsible for both promoting nuclear power and regulating its safety. If the accident was caused by a stuck rod, the blame would fall on the sloppy maintenance and poor design of the reactor. Now, if the accident was an intentional act of sabotage, triggered by a love triangle, or a divorce threat, the AEC could claim the reactor was safe and that no design could have prevented a madman from destroying it. But the rod had a long history of stickiness. Engineering logs showed the control rods had stuck or failed to drop properly over 80 times in the months leading up to the blast. So the AEC had to downplay this highly likely mechanical scenario in favor of the more sensational personal story to protect the nuclear industry's reputation, hence why an incredibly long and detailed report was created. It shows commitment, credibility, and expertise. More importantly, the level of detail makes one think that they can't be wrong or lying. The final report on SL-1 is often praised for its technical clarity, and rightly so. But what it did even more effectively was something quieter. It shifted the story. By grounding the accident in a reconstructed rod position, the focus moved away from design and toward action. The reactor became a passive victim of misuse rather than an active participant in its own destruction. A system that tolerated razor-thin margins was reframed as a system betrayed by a single deviation. The report, while making all information available, cleverly masked known reactor problems as details, only to lead you away from questioning the information, transforming engineering uncertainty into numerical conviction. And once that happened, responsibility had somewhere safe to land. No other position would cause the accident, so the operator had to lift the rod that far. At the end of the day, SL-1 didn't fail because someone broke the rules. It failed because the system was designed to depend on humans never crossing a boundary it refused to mark, measure, or protect.